Hey there, today I'm going to be talking about the advancements in motion control. We're going to be going over the history along with some of the mechanics of how it works, so if you're interested, stick around. First of all, let's go over the history. Starting in 1976 with Sega's Heavyweight Champ, it was one of the earliest examples of motion control in gaming, and it used punching glove controls which players needed to physically move to punch. You can see it right here on the bottom left. You can see this little mitt things you just use to punch it. Our next example would be in 1981 with KO Punch, also by Sega. And you use a pressurized punching bag to detect a player's strength. And it's very similar to punching games you see today. Our next one was in 1985. Super Scaler had the player sit and physically control a motorbike. You might see something like this in arcades or movie theaters today. It was the first example of full body control. And of course, Nintendo, as their competitors, would move into the scene. Um, and one of their earliest devices was a Power Pad in 1986. It was a dance/fitness mat, kind of similar to something like Dance Dance Revolution. But if you do look at it on the bottom right, you can see it's a bit different. It has 12 different buttons that you can use to control it. So far, what we went over isn't really what you would typically think as motion controls. So let's move on to our next thing, which is the Power Glove, which is probably one of the most famous early examples of motion controls. It was introduced by Nintendo in 1989. It translated hand movements and finger curls into on-screen action. Um, it also famously featured a wrist-mounted control pad that allowed gamers to program their own button configurations. Um, and it was based off of NASA's VPL data glove on the bottom left, right. Of course, and it was marketed as the peripheral that would change gaming forever. And of course, although it was based off of the VPL data glove, they didn't have the resources to make it as powerful. So the Power Glove was widely considered inaccurate due to technical limitations. In the same year, a company called Broderbund Software developed the U-Force for the NES, which actually used a pair of infrared sensors set at a right angle to each other to read the player's hand movements. The reason why this failed, even though it was actually pretty accurate for its time, was due to its readable area being far too small. You can even see if you look at the picture on the bottom right, it's really not that big of an area. Um, Next was the Sega Activator. It was released for the Sega Genesis in 1993, and it was based on the light harp invented by Asaph Gurner. You can see that on the top right. It was a plastic octagonal ring which detected specific movements from the player with infrared sensors, similar in a way to the U-Force, but for full body movement rather than just the hands. It was unsuccessful due to unwieldiness and inaccuracy. And although the technology would see more success in arcades with the release of Dragon Ball Z VRVS, also released by Sega. So motion controls would see a bit of a hiatus in the early 2000s on home consoles. However, that does not mean that they were not successful within arcades, mostly led by Konami. In 2000, they released Police 911, which used a camera to detect the player's movements like dodging and taking cover. It was fairly accurately reflected by the player's character in game. Um, in 2001, they released Mocap Boxing along with Blade of Honor, both games which use the same technology. In 2002, Namco released Mazan Flash of the Blade. This game used a katana sword controller which accurately detected the player's hand gestures. In the next couple of years, there were some more home console attempts at motion control. In 2003, Sega released the EyeToy, which was a motion detecting camera for the PlayStation 2. You can see that on the bottom left. And in 2004, SSD Company released the, forgive me if I pronounce this wrong, Xavix port, which was created as an attempt to get players off the couch, quote, quote. It was very similar to the Wii, which would not be released 2 years later. However, the one thing that I did learn about this was that it had a separate controller for each game that was released. Of course, you can't really talk about motion controls without talking about its high point, which was the Nintendo Wii. It was released in 2006 to vast commercial success by Nintendo. It popularized the use of accelerometers, which I'm going to go over a little bit later. They detect approximate orientation and acceleration of the controller. So with the Wii, you can kind of turn around the controller and move it around and shake it, and it will be able to detect that type of movement. It also uses image sensors so that the remote can be used as a pointer. And it inspired similar devices such as the PlayStation Move, which you can see on the bottom left, and the HP Swing, which you can see on the bottom. Of course, both were not nearly as successful as the Wii. So now let's talk about some of the mechanics of motion control. So going back to the accelerometer, which, as I mentioned before, was used with the Wii, it measures the motion of a structure, and basically what it does is it uses an electrical mechanical sensor that's designed to measure either static or dynamic acceleration. Static acceleration would be considered constant force such as gravity or friction, whereas dynamic acceleration would be considered any sort of non-uniform movement such as vibration or shock. And basically, it produces an electrical charge which is proportional to the force exerted on the object. So, going back to the Wiimote, say you just like moved it a little bit like normal, it wouldn't really create that much of a shock. However, if you were to shake it like crazy, it would create a pretty big shock that would tell the system, hey, there's some sort of vibration going on. And in certain games that would create some sort of input. Another method would be infrared sensors. Basically what they do is they emit infrared radiation which hits a nearby object, bounces back, the receiver, which detects the movement. It can also be used for depth perception, so you can see on the bottom right, there's an image of a person that was recreated with depth perception in mind. You see the object in front of the person is darker. The person themselves is like kind of a dark gray. Some objects in the background which are very light. And basically, this can be used to reconstruct an object and determine its movements within a 3D space. This was actually used by the Xbox Kinect, which basically did exactly as I just described. Finally, one of the more interesting ones, in my opinion, gesture recognition. This is a type of perceptual computing user interface that allows computers to capture and interpret human gestures as commands. So there's two types. There's device-based. Think back to the Power Glove, which was a device that the computer was able to recognize as moving in space. It requires the use of a physical device. There's also vision-based, which just uses a camera. And they could see things such as you moving your arms around, you making different gestures with your hands, etc. And then the process of recognition A camera feeds image data into a sensing device that's connected to a computer. So in other words, just like video feed. It recognizes meaningful gesture from a predetermined gesture library. So like an example of gesture library would be this on the bottom left. You see like the different hand gestures mean different things. Each registered real-time gesture is correlated to a computer command. You see the commands underneath the hand signals, and then the computer executes the interpreted command. Alright, that's all for today. If you're interested, I'm going to leave my sources in the description below so you can read more on this. Thank you for listening.